My role at Heritage Malta is to organise the collections data produced by colleagues across all of our museums. This data takes two main forms. There's the catalogue data, which is collection items which are produced by curators and researchers at each museum, and digital representations of those items captured by the Digitisation Unit. So all the data that Jacob drops onto our nice clean servers. So, following the FAIR principles model for data management, we try to ensure that our data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and most importantly, reusable. So in this talk, I'm going to refer to these principles in the context of the challenges that we're facing at Heritage Malta to bring our collections into the digital realm over the past few years. So over the past 2 years in particular, we've been implementing a collections management software solution that will eventually hold all of the national collection data. So this involves bringing together all the inventories, catalogues, digital media assets, conservation records, all of this material into one single portal, which is the CMS, and this addresses the findability aspect of this. The CMS also provides the means to protect this data, so to make sure that the right people have access to the data and that certain fields are secure, including IPR management and the data center infrastructure that Jacob mentioned earlier as well. All of this data is obviously held in-house, so we're, as the national agency, we feel that holding onto our own data is a very important part of our responsibility to these collections. So that, again, this is the accessibility side of FAIR. So we store this data in interoperable formats following spectrum collection management standards, metadata structures and concept reference models such as Dublin Core and SciDoc CRM, standard vocabularies such as ULAN, AAT, geonames, and so on. So again, interoperability. And then reuse is enabled through the CMS, through a private and public portal that publishes our data in consistent ways. So, as most people would be familiar, lots of paper. The first step we took towards good data management was reviewing the types of data that we'd held across Heritage Malta, about our collections, where they're stored, how they're accessed. So the first job was to work through museum collections, the Malta Maritime Museum right here being the first collection that we tackled with colleagues here. So we searched through the various paper files and spreadsheets with the intention to compile a single data set that could be turned into consistent catalogue records. Meanwhile, whilst that research was being undertaken by curators and researchers and collections management unit, the structure of these catalogue records was being devised with input from curators across Heritage Malta to create a suitable set of fields and associated vocabularies which we implemented into the CMS, and this is a back-end photograph of that. So beyond the technical elements, as I mentioned before, the CMS also provides inherent frameworks that follow spectrum standards, so the Museum Collections Management Standard. So it provides procedures for accessioning, automatic auditing features. It can log when a user changes data in a particular field. We can roll back changes, so this improves accountability. And it tracks movements of an object, so again, by who, when, and why. So by the time we began to migrate the Malta Maritime Museum data into the CMS, we had a platform that could hold metadata in a consistent way that generally conforms to international standards and enables good collections management procedures. The CMS is, of course, still a work in progress. However, I want to focus more in this talk on the reusability aspect of our data. How can people outside of Heritage Malta benefit from this quite major behind-the-scenes shift? So as already mentioned earlier, eMuseum is the public-facing portal to access the combined catalogue of all Heritage Malta museums. And this will be launched later this summer, as Tony mentioned earlier. So through this platform, we will publish descriptions of our objects, group them into collections, link artist works with the biographies and so on. All of the metadata about our collections that we want to make available will be accessible through here. You can obviously view digital media, images, documents, video, audio, deep zooming to see details of objects. And as mentioned earlier, objects that are in reserved collections that don't get to see the light of day will also be on here, so we'll be able to expand the accessibility. But 3D objects are not yet handled natively. We can install a IIIF viewer, but this comes with its own issues. But what it does have is an API which we can leverage to share all the data with other websites that we build, with exhibition installations, such as the exhibition downstairs. And also we can use this data live. We can pull the data into games that we produce. So this API is a very important feature as it reiterates the importance of being able to update one single data set that gets pushed to different outputs. So this way data is always up to date and reliable, therefore usable. As mentioned as well, Heritage Malta is the national aggregator for Europeana, and we are currently preparing our data to share with Europeana through eMuseum. For Twinit, for this campaign, we had prepared the data manually, but obviously this is not sustainable in the long run. eMuseum supports OEI PMH as a protocol for metadata harvesting, so we can get our data into Europeana by scraping the data held in eMuseum at regular intervals. So an important issue for us and for this conference is that the Cittadella 3D model is hosted on Sketchfab, which is a paid service and it's not on our own servers. So also there isn't a standard way yet to handle the storage or distribution of 3D objects, either in technical terms of standards, as well as the frameworks to comprehensively manage copyrights and IPR. And any models that we share with Europeana or wherever don't contain the level of detail of metadata that we find in EXIF data attached to a photograph, for example, or the paradata explaining how the model was created. And these are important points for us, and this is what I want to stress in this next little section. So Digital Lab Notebook is software that goes some way to address this particular problem. We've adopted this software recently. Actually, we'd been made aware of it quite recently through Dr. Ionadis, who had highlighted the value of this open source package that allows us to document the complex post-processing of data produced through computational photography projects, so photogrammetry, RTI, multispectral imaging, and so on. So DLN collects and manages paradata about the equipment we used, who was involved in capture, what the subject was, how we processed that data, how the data was prepared for archival storage and use, the relationships between sets of data and the outputs at different levels of detail, and also captures the rights of each data set. The information captured here is both metadata and paradata, data that's inherent to the files themselves and data that documents the manipulation of those files during the creation of our 3D objects. Whilst EXIF metadata embedded in a single photograph within a model captures the camera type, lens, exposure, aperture, and so on, it's much more difficult to fully capture the workflows and complex processing involved to create a photogrammetry model. So the CMS can do this, but to quite a limited extent, and more to the point that that software is not intended for that purpose. So DLN goes quite a long way to address this gap. So just very briefly, through this we can create projects that contain important information, including the subject, the registration number of the object, the various stakeholders involved, dates, locations where the data is stored, and so on. We can maintain equipment lists to track what pieces were used and group them according to specific rigs that we use commonly. And each image set can be managed separately. So data from photogrammetry camera 1 is held separate to and described separately to photogrammetry camera 2 or a LiDAR rig, because obviously each rig can have different settings. Ideally not in the case of photogrammetry, but again, we can track exactly what those details are. And the outputs, or the work products in the term here, are generated from that data. So multiple OBJ models of one object with different levels of detail could be generated and documented separately but linked together by project. You can also track the post-processing that our team undertakes on each product. This is especially important as this documentation tells us what each end object can be used for. Is it suitable for basic web viewing? Can it be used in a game engine such as Unreal or Unity? Is it suited to scientific research, or are the textures just too low quality? The software can also check data sets for errors that may lead to processing issues. So in my little brief summary of what we're doing at Heritage Malta, I've highlighted several challenges that we face for good 3D data management in particular. So I think the advantages of the CMS and eMuseum in general are quite clear. They bring Heritage Malta up to a baseline of good data management practices, particularly regarding metadata. DLN is a very useful tool to document the processing of 3D objects, but the software does have some limitations and is separate to our CMS. It's valuable as it allows us to document how an object was created. It's paradata. And this is very useful to document our methods and allows us to share these projects with partners in more meaningful ways. There is, however, a lack of internationally accepted 3D standards to follow, which will continue to make models difficult to reconstruct and use in the future, particularly if they don't come with comprehensive metadata and paradata to help us understand how they were created. And finally, perhaps our biggest challenge in terms of reuse is hosting 3D objects, which we hope the Common European Data Space for Cultural Heritage will go some way to alleviate. Whilst we've invested heavily in the infrastructure to host our own files, web viewing access to complex models is very difficult to do at a large scale. And I think this is one of the main hindrances to the reuse of 3D data in general. But we are actively looking for solutions. So thank you very much. Thank you.